most of us have trouble talking about ourselves. I'm used to it because I've been in the non-Indigenous world a long time, and that's always the way they operate. So I'll do that. But I think it's important to remember that in our traditional way, often people didn't have to introduce themselves because they were well known. They're already identified and known, right? And since it's for the community, it seems to me that maybe we should be trying to follow that tradition. I'm Bill Mussel. I'm the oldest child of Genevieve and William Mussel. And my aunts are Martha James, and my uncle is Uncle Henry. And I'm the oldest of 6 children in our family. My parents, when they first married, built a little cabin and lived down Wellington. And then collected the building materials to build their own home where they raised us children. And then what's interesting is Grandpa Jones had, with Dad, chosen a location where Dad might build his own home when he married. And he and Grandpa planted an orchard. We had a big apple orchard with plum trees and cherries and pears and so on. So when the house was built, we had around us a very large orchard that Grandpa and Dad had planted, which I thought was kind of a nice idea because we had all these trees to look after. And I remember I was pretty good at picking fruit, picking the plums and stuff. And in those days, we picked them and sold them. And on the same site, Mom and Dad built or created a dairy farm. When they stayed with Granny and Grandpa in the village here, they had milking cows, and they actually milked cows in the late years of the Depression in the 1930s. And Mom and Dad told us about how, because we had fresh milk, Mom used to make cottage cheese and make butter and so on with as byproducts of the milk. And the people from town, the non-Indigenous people, would come down and trade, and were happy to be able to get fresh butter and milk and cottage cheese and that kind of stuff. So we grew up on a farm and learned to milk cows before we started school, and actually had cows until 1951, because we were flooded out in 1948 and flooded again in 1950. And each time, well, even in 1950 when we were flooded, we still were milking cows. And when they would go and feed during the day, because the floods are in May and June, July, they would walk along the slough, because the land was a little higher, into the main part of the reserve because there was grass, and they would feed there. And then they'd walk back to the barn along the edge, because the barn where we did the milking wasn't flooded, but it was surrounded by water. There was so much water that actually we have pictures where maybe 6-8 inches of the posts along the road you could see through the water when it was flooded. And Fred and I, when we were in 1948 and 1950, used to take the canoe and deliver 2 or 3 cans of milk, fresh milk, from our milk house to the dike here. It was interesting. Our reserve actually was identified as a farming community. And because we were identified as a farming community, we were permitted to have our own day school, because it was believed that with a day school, kids attending the school could help their parents who were farmers. But as it turned out, really the only farmers were my mom and dad and Granny and Grandpa that helped them get started before they moved down the road here to have a farm. It's interesting, my parents, when they married and they had us, both knew something about residential schools. In particular, my dad, he had been brought by the Northwest Mounted Police to residential school on the island. He was brought with Uncle Henry and Auntie Martha, and they had to go to this Catholic residential school. And he ended up not having to stay there because he was asked by the superintendent, by the head priest of the school, what he wanted to become. My dad was 9 years old when he went there, he said, and he was a big boy for his age, and he was bilingual. He spoke Halkamilam, local language, and he also spoke English. His mother spoke English in Halkamilam. His grandmother spoke English in Halkamilam. So he learned. He had lots of practice learning the language. And so when the head priest asked him about residential school, about what he wanted to become, he told him that he wanted to become a priest. And so they found their way home from the island. What a blessing that he didn't have to stay in that circumstance. But what was interesting, Dad said they got home and they were busy doing things like they were always doing before, and the Northwest Mounted Police, before the RCMP, came down checking to see if any kids were around that weren't at school. And again discovered that they were home, and they brought Dad to Mission Residential School down the river here. And Dad said he at that time was placed with 9-year-old kids. They were in elementary school. They were only doing grade 3 or something like that, 2 or 3. But he said because he was big and he was strong, they had him working on the farm with the bigger boys. And Dad said that he was unhappy with the fact that he was working so hard, and he said, when you're little like that, and it's a residential school, you get hardly anything to eat. So he said, I was always hungry. And he said, I said to the guy who's our boss, if you want me to work like a man, you better feed me like a man, because I just can't work hard because we don't get hardly anything to eat. And they actually kicked him out of the school. They sent him home, which was another blessing. Thank God he could talk, and he had the words to express really what he thought. And that was the end of his schooling. He never ever went back. All of us were really very popular in the elementary school. And I enjoyed school and went on to high school, and I graduated and went on to university after that. Yeah. So it had nothing to do with residential school. But after I became a qualified teacher and a qualified social worker, which I did more studies I did at university, I ended up working full-time with people in our own communities, teaching mostly. I was working with people who were products of the residential school system. And so I learned a great deal about what people experienced, what they didn't learn, how they were deprived of lots of opportunities, like learning how to learn. It was something that they did not learn in school. In fact, in the public school system, they don't teach you to learn how to learn either. But that's something you really need to develop as a competence if you really want to do well, especially at the post-secondary level. And so, yeah, most of the work I've done has been like up to the Williams Lake area. I worked up there for years and years with First Nations. I worked in Prince George and north, through to Terrace and Prince Rupert and Queen Charlotte Islands. I've worked all over the province. The work I've done here has been as a volunteer. I was the spokesperson for the 24 bands of the area when I represented them on the Union BC Indian Chiefs Council. I was there that way for about 5 years. I did that work. I was on the executive of the North American Indian Brotherhood for about 4 years of my life. I was the founding president of the Kokolitsa Cultural Center in 1982, 81, 82. And I was on the founding council of the Fraser Valley College. I was appointed by the NDP government as a representative. Shirley Leon was another one, and Vivian Ferguson, who was another. We were the 3 people on that founding council. But yeah, I've worked, but always as a volunteer in terms of being president and filling different leadership roles and that kind of thing. I also taught for the Douglas College in Chilliwack. First course I taught for the school district. I was working in Abbotsford then, in the 60s. I taught English for New Canadians as a night school course because the superintendent was upset that I didn't apply to work full-time as a teacher in the school district. And I said I enjoyed being a parole officer and being a probation officer more than I would want to be as a classroom teacher. And I said for that reason I'm doing that work, and they paid me well. For the first time we have, in my view, we have a collective of people, maybe 10, 15 people that are making time to ask questions and explore questions about why we live like we live, what we can do to help people feel better about themselves, and how we can inspire them to do more in regard to creating opportunities for their children and other relatives and other people in the community, so that we actually have a true community, you know. When I was a child in this village, people were friendly. People loved spending time together. People did things together. I once saw a photograph of the village, our village, with the houses during the 1950s and 1960s. And there were actually footpaths connecting the houses. You don't find footpaths today connecting houses. We didn't have them in the 70s and 80s really either, because people had cars and people had television and people had other things to do. And it seemed that as time passed, people spent less and less time together. And when we spend less and less time together, our families become insular. You know, we kind of isolate ourselves from other people. And how do we learn? You know, how do we go about learning about life and learning about ourselves and other people if we don't spend time with those people and meeting people elsewhere and going elsewhere and discovering that there's a huge world out there, and people who care about each other look after one another, right? And when we had people visiting one another and whatnot, they cared about each other, they helped build things together, they did sports together, they cleaned the graveyards together. You know, we had community meals, that kind of stuff. That's something that I knew when I was young, but you seldom see it. But it's only we ourselves who can change it. Nobody can change it for us, but we have to want to change it ourselves. A vision for a community plan to identify the kind of things we need to do to be able to accomplish what we want and that kind of thing. I think what's critical is that we have a land base, that we learn to value the land, and that we build on the land and know how important it is to our culture, to our identity, and maintain our boundaries and look after what we have, because I think one of the greatest tragedies that we could ever live with is that in 5 and 6 generations, we have no land base. And that's a risk we run, because I think the communities, the provincial government, the federal government, the white people living around us would love to have control of what little land we have left. And we have to be really careful about protecting it and making sure that it's safe, right? If we don't look after it and struggle to make sure we have it and it's for our future generations, you know, our future children may not know what it is to have a home. You know, and I think that's the risk we run. You know, think about the numbers. We just added 100 and some band members to our community recently, and there were people who had a history of being here and having ancestors in this territory. Again, they're anxious to have a home, and you know, not enough of us, I think about how important a home is. And having a home is to have a land base like we have, and knowing the history of our families that protected that land base and did things to build things and create a lifestyle where we could make a living, you know. I remember in the 50s and 60s when somebody from every house in the village left home in the morning to go to work. They'd go and cut wood across the river. They'd go to men would all join together and go on the canoes across the river to cut cottonwood and cedar and that kind of thing. And they'd come home in the afternoon, but they'd go together to work. They'd work together all day. They'd come home. You know, and you don't see that today. It would be lovely to see groups of people working like that together.
Okay, my name is Mary Tommy. Both my grandmothers are from this reserve. My dad's mother was Mary Ben, and her dad was William Ben, and she had a sister, Hilda Ben. She is buried on the reserve here. My grandmother on my mom's side was Mary Louis, and her Indian name was Wasowith. And I was named after both grandmothers. My dad often told me the story of how I got my name. When I was born, they didn't know what to call me, and they had books and books of babies' names, but couldn't decide on one. And then my grandmother Mary on my mother's side walked in, and Dad said, "What shall we call the baby?" And she said, "Call her Mary." And Dad said, "That's it, that's her name. She's Mary after both grandmothers." And so that's how I got my name. I remember being down here when I was a young child, and how everything was so different from what it is now. Houses were small, and they were built on like stumps, and you could see under the houses, and you could see taps running every 3 or 4 houses, and people got water from those taps. I always wondered why my parents wouldn't teach me my language. I would ask them, "Teach me how to speak Ho'okume'elam," and they wouldn't. And I didn't understand why. I'd ask Mom and she wouldn't. I'd ask my dad and he wouldn't. And it wasn't till I got older that I realized it had to do with the residential school and the politics, I guess. Because if you were caught speaking your language, you were shunned at or punished. So I grew up not learning, but I kept trying to learn. My parents were alcoholics, and when Mom would bring people home to party, I'd ask them, "How do you say this in Indian, and how would you say that in Indian?" And they would tell me, so I'd learn all these words. And then I'd say something to Mom in the language, and she says, no, that's Thompson language." So all these friends, some were from Thompson, someone from here, and I would get the 2 languages mixed up because they were different dialects. And so I gave up trying to learn it. Grew up in the white community, and it wasn't till I got older that I learned that I had relatives on the reserve. And remembering when my Mom and my brother brought me to the reserve to introduce me to relatives. And then living uptown, how it was so different. And going to school was very different because I'd play with the white children and they would call me Indian, and I'd play with the Indian children and they would call me Whitey. And so it was really hard, and I didn't know which way to turn, to the white children or the Indian children, so I ended up with both. I didn't know how to choose friends, so I'd just go up to them and ask them, "Will you be my friend?" And they would say, "Yeah." So I had friends on both sides, and that's how I grew up. Me and my girlfriend, Sharon Peters, we walked from Hope all the way to Chilliwack, and it took us a whole day. And then we walked back from Chilliwack up to Hope, and it took a whole day to get back. And we stopped at my Auntie Flo's in Popcom on the way back, and she got really upset with us and gave us a scolding. "Don't you know there's cougars out there? You shouldn't be walking." And so that's the last time we did that. But back then they didn't have a freeway, it was the Trans-Canada Highway. But we enjoyed ourselves. We sang songs and told stories all the way down and back, and Sharon was a very good singer, and she still is. I used to go with my mom. We used to go to different families, and my mom would help them can fish and dry fish and different places. Like sometimes it would be in Hague and Hope. Sometimes it'd be in Ruby Creek or Laidlaw. Just she traveled lots to different reserves, and she always took me with her. But she would always help them work in can, and when the season was over, they gave her some to take home because she didn't have a husband because they broke up, so that was her way of feeding us. I got married and I had 3 children from Junior Peters. We weren't married, it was just common law. And he cheated on me, so I figured I'm not living with someone that can't be faithful, so I left. And his mother gave him a scolding and told him to bring me back, and he tried, but I wouldn't go back. And then I met someone else and married him, and we had a child. And he did the same thing, so I left him too, and we divorced. And then I remarried Hank Tommy. We had 1 child. I guess when I got married to my husband Hank, I thought he was the perfect fellow for me. Not knowing we were related, but I seen him for about a year before we got married, and with the troubles that I had with my other husbands, I thought he's not going to be the same, that he's so different, so lovable, and he was so good with children, and he knew how to discipline them, and he was kind also. I think it's just to be kind to everybody and not to be judgmental. I think there was a time in my life that I was judgmental. I'd see somebody that was drunk or on drugs or something. I thought, I can't stand that person. But I've learned that a lot of our people were alcoholics, and a lot of people were on drugs, and that if God is love, you have to love those people too, and you have to forgive them. It's very important to forgive people. I'm not perfect. Nobody on earth is perfect, so yeah, everybody has to be forgiven, and the only way to treat people is with respect and love, and be kind to them.
I'm Gary Williams. I'm from the Skwah, and I've been here most of my life, except when I went to residential school. There was a TB hospital that I was in for 4 years before the residential. If you take the way that we were treated in the early days, like we didn't have a vote, we were put in jail for having a bottle of beer, give you 10 days and behind bars, and send you in with the people in Ocala, all the convicts. Second time was 20 days, and he goes up to 60 days for, So anytime you were caught, you think you're going to get caught with any alcohol, you destroyed it, because you weren't going to spend all that time behind bars. We didn't have much of a life, and anytime we had made money, that's where it went. We kind of drowned out the reality of what was happening. And when I first went to the States, I was working over there with the natives, and they were asking me, how much per capita do you guys get? Like they get all the money from their road tax, water tax, the wood from the lumber, and so they were quite well off. And you know, they had judges, their own police, their own everything. And I told them they don't really recognize us as being human beings yet, you know, from the way they treat us. And I found a lot of things that weren't right. We used to be always hungry there, and you know, that was part of life. And we'd work in a potato cellar or apple, you know, potato cellar, and we sorting out potatoes that were rotten, but we bring some back, you know, like some guys would be hungry and they would give them carrots or turnips or even cabbage they were happy to get. And you got to learn to share. Like sometimes we go stealing apples and down the orchard, or else we go in the apple cellar. This one time we brought this one guy with us, and he's really clumsy, and he was, you know, we just went through a small opening, and he come down there and he landed in the bin like that, and he was moaning and crying. I told him to shut up, you're going to get us caught, you know. But we had to drag him out of there, and you know, he wasn't much good for stealing. But I learned to be independent. I was before that, because I left home and I used to go to Seattle looking for work. And I'd stay there until I found something that, you know, work, either in the sawmill. Later on, I got to be a logger. And I never looked back after I got to logging. But later on in life, it gets kind of disgusting when you, like one time I was going to work and the boss was saying, "Isn't this a beautiful day?" I said, "No, this is sickening. You look at all, maybe miles and miles of stumps and all that beautiful land destroyed, and then you get to looking at where does it go." I think my resentment for the white people would be one, like we had a white woman chief, and the hardest thing for me to do was to go and ask her for a handout. Like, they wouldn't give you money, they would give you a voucher for food. And that was something that I have a hard time to go and ask her for help. And I knew how she looked down on our family, because my mother used to drink. And I knew that there was so much resentment against our family. You know, the band council were, you know, trying to get houses for they were putting in for a house, and then they wouldn't give it to her, give it to them. And the church had to step in. Well, there was a picture in progress about the time, but our family, and there's 14, 15 heads sticking out of the window, and all living under that one roof. And you know, the poverty didn't help. And I think my mother would put us on the bus as soon as we got back from Kamloops, from the residential, go pick berries for the summer. So that was, it got you to where you were able to make money and be strong. Being able to be self-reliant, even though the money wasn't all that great, that you earned enough to get some food, and food was scarce. You know, like we didn't have a fridge or anything, and it was good to get some meat on the table, and you got to be being able to put up with a lot. Well, would come later on in life when, you know, like my first set of kids, I didn't get to be around too much, and then they were taken away. Then you get to realize that our kids are a blessing, you know, the grandkids, and that makes me happy to see them all. You know, we have these celebrations once in a while, birthdays, and have everybody together. Even though they're noisy and everything, it's happy to see your bloodline. That's all part of your bloodline, and they'll be there long after I'm gone. And
again, my name is Beverly Williams. My Indian name is loosely that came from my grandmother, and I'm from the Skwah Reserve. I remember things when I was 4 years old, and I was the oldest. There was 3 brothers ahead of me, and I was the first girl. So I already had like responsibilities to be helping my mother, and so I used to set the table, and this was a bad memory for me because it affected my life. My brothers and my uncle used to stay with us because that was my mom's brother. But they used to always tease me, and then I used to get mad, and then I would have tantrums, and I was screaming and screaming and screaming. And with what my mom, my grandmother did, we never had electricity, we never had running water. So they took me out to the pump and put water on me until I quit screaming. And so I think that's what affected. Then I wouldn't, I couldn't get mad. And the only way I'd get mad was just myself. I used to get mad at myself because I can't express myself. No, I have a hard time. I can't show my anger, and I don't know if that had to do with my. I never was married legally, and so I don't know how many times. I think there's about 4 times I had relationship. They lasted about 10 years, and then it would break up because someone would take my partner away, and I couldn't fight. I didn't know how to fight. And my last relationship was really the hardest, because I have an adopted son, and I didn't know why I was having such a hard time. Because every time I went home, I'd be just crying and crying. And my son would console me. And then my mom came to me and told me a story. So I think that was a real good story for me, because when she was 5 years old, she lost her dad. Her dad died, and so she got passed around from relative to relative, and then eventually she ended up in the boarding school where I went to. And then she said when she was very little, she made a promise. I have children, I'm not going to leave the father, because she didn't have a father at 5 years old. And she kept that promise. She stayed with my dad. After 15 children, she stayed with the dad. I don't remember. I had we went to those, I don't know if you call them reunions that they had up in Kamloops. And I used to bring my son with me, and I said I want him to learn about how we were treated. And one time I was up Kamloops with one of my schoolmates. And one lady comes to me and she said, ask me my name, and I told her my name. And she started crying, and she said, I used to look after you when you were little. When I was in school, I was always put with the smaller people, like the 4 and 5 year olds, even though I was 8 years old, they'd always put me with the smaller kids. But anyway, I didn't understand what she meant, that she used to look after me, until I went to one of those reunions. I call it a reunion. And there was guys there, they were about 80 years old, and they were telling how they used to get abused or sexually abused, and I don't remember anything like that. And so I said, oh, that's what she was talking about. She was looked after me, because I was little. And another incident was at the elders' meeting on the island. And they asked for all the Kamloops once to meet at a certain place. And this lady comes up to me and she tells me her name. And she told me everything about me when I was in grade 5. I was in grade 5. She told me everything, what I used to do, what I was good at, and that's when I realized that I didn't remember. And it didn't bother me before, but when she told me everything about grade 5, and So it was when they had the counselors, where you could make an appointment with the counselors to talk about anything, and I couldn't remember. It didn't bother me then, but maybe it's for the better if I didn't know. If I didn't know why I don't remember. Well, when I was, I don't know, about 33, I guess, and I was into drinking. I had a very hard time to get off. I tried like for 3 years after I came back from Montreal, and I tried, and I go to meetings, and then when we were at the canoe race over in Lummi, and my dad was there, and that's all he said to me. I don't want you to die. That's all he said. And then I just quit. I never touched it anymore. So that's 1975. Over, must be 42, I guess. So that's something I remember. Just learn how to help. Learn how to help without being asked. Some of my grandnephews, they're always watching or waiting for me to, I'll just say, where's so-and-so? And then somebody will go and run and get them. And then they know I want them to do something, and they just does it so willingly, And then when they finish the work, then you say thank you. That's what I'm trying to do now. When somebody does something for me, I'll just say thank you. Even at the office, I think they get surprised. It's a surprise, but it's means something when somebody says that to you. Thank you. They don't know. They don't know that we'd appreciate it. But I'm trying to do that now. Even if it's just a little thing, I'll say thank you.
My name is Jack Mussel. I was born in 1942, January 29th today. Matter of fact, it's my birthday today. When I was getting to the age of going to school, they wanted to initiate myself and my cousin Norman to start attending school so that we could fall in the suit of my brother Fred, and Bill and Fred were both going to day school here. And I would actually walk up the road with them to here, to this right here. And then as soon as the bell rang, I went to the bush. I said, wake me up when you guys go by, because I'm going to play in the trees. I played in the trees all day. So pretty soon I coaxed Norman to come with me, and him and we played in the trees until about 2 or 3 o'clock, whatever. But anyway, I didn't get anything here, but my mother at the same time was fighting to get us into public school, tooth and nail. And lots of flack from that. And eventually, they allowed Bill and Fred to go to school, to public school. But Bill led the way. This is 72 years ago. Bill led the way, and it's lucky Bill led the way because they said they were going on trial, and Bill is a whiz, and he's always been, in the books and stuff. And then I eventually made it to grade 1, I followed. And again, I would say all I was a real dreamer. My brain, I got a photographic memory. I've got a mind. My mind is miles ahead of everybody else because that's the way my brain works. And it can't stop. It just goes, right? You may only have a few tools. Learn to use them. You might have a whole pile of tools. Learn to use them. If you've got one or two tools, make them work. And that's your brain, everything, your mind, everything. And you have to believe you can do it. If you don't believe it and get shot down, you never rise. You can't rise. So I can honestly say, by that little education that I learned in school, I have passed it on to all the people that ever worked around me. Pretty well everybody in this whole reserve and many others have worked for me. Many others. I'm saying thousands, right? Not just 500 or something. Over 1,000 people have worked. Nobody's ever quit. Nobody's ever let me down the line. And you know why? There's such a thing as faith and trust. I'm not going to yakking, I'm not cutting in you, but you just do what you are capable of doing. And do it well, because I'm not going to help you. You're going to be on your own, and you're going to prove it to yourself that you can do it. And the people around me is how we grow. Okay, there's lots of friction and stuff in the reserve and lots of storytelling and all the rest of that stuff, but I haven't changed since I was a little kid. And if you want to learn more about me, I could tell you right from a little kid how things all happened in my life. It was just there. Indian business is good business. You think about it. You guys, because you're members, think about it. When I looked at it, I never looked at it very long. I just flipped the pages through, and I said, Indian affairs is the chicken farmer. Okay? The chicken farmer gets money that's coming down to you. So whether it's housing, whether it's down, I would say the chicken farmer's divvying out the chicken feed to you. If you were the chickens, I'd be looking at new houses and healthier conditions, so you're laying eggs and producing and all the rest of this stuff. But I said, they start snitching money for themselves and they get less money down there. And I said, the people are waiting for the chicken feed. That's what I'm saying at the office, chicken feed. And they got them all waiting there. And the ones that succeed are the ones that leave the chicken coop. They come back and sleep in the chicken coop. They leave the chicken coop. They come back and they sleep in the chicken coop. They are not dependent on chicken feed. See? So the people that have the get up and go, that wander off and just come to sleep in the chicken coop are further ahead than the ones that's waiting for Wednesday, whenever. You know what I mean? So that's what I said, and you know what? We've absolutely swung in that direction right now.
Sayisatla Skwah Talitokwa Chiam. My English name is Vivian Williams, and I am from Chiam First Nation. My husband's from this reserve, Skwah Nation. And I went to school to become a teacher because I used to teach but get very little money. And so Ethel Gardner, she's from this reserve too, she convinced me to get my teaching degree. And then I was teacher in School District 78. My main area was language, but I got a bachelor's in science and socials, and pails and pots. They're getting them all ready and piling everyone into trucks and whoever had a car. And we traveled, and I didn't know where then, but I know now we went to Mission. and we went to the river, and we were told to get into the river. And we were told not to be cold. We were told not to be scared because there's fish just hitting our feet. And we had to walk into the river, and no, you can't be cold, my grandmother said. So we couldn't be cold, and we couldn't be scared. And I looked down this way. There's so many First Nations hooping and hollering. And look down that way, there's just First Nations lining the river. And I said, what is going on here? So we got into the water, and the fish were hitting our feet. And we had to kind of herd them towards my mother and my grandmother. And then I remember my uncle there, and he's using his hat to catch these hooligans. And you just see them shimmering in the river. That will never be again. You know, it will never be like that again. And my grandmother said, she said, you will never see this ever again. She said, I've witnessed this with sturgeon. She said the sturgeon filled the river. Now, she said, that's gone. And she says, you will never see this ever again. And she was right. The hooligans are scarce. And that's one memory that I will cherish. And we came home and we had a feast. And it's sad, like my kids will never know that experience of seeing those hooligans and frying them up. And because if they're offered somewhere, my kids will go, But they're my favorite, and like it's just a sad thing. And to have my grandmother say the river was filled with sturgeon at one time, you could see them. And she said the river's getting so polluted, and that was how many years ago? And it's just getting worse. I witnessed for myself that the birds would talk to her when we were outside. I remember this big black, I thought it was a crow, but I'm pretty sure it was a raven, and he was walking beside us, and he's talking to my grandmother. And he was here, I was here, and my grandmother was there. And he's looking like this to her, and she'd be looking like that to him, and she would be getting mad. And I couldn't understand, but she said, he's talking Halkamelam. But to me, all he was doing was like that. And it's like, And that's what they'll do to me if I leave my home. I'll go, what are you saying? I don't know. And that's all they'll do is, and they'll talk back to it like that. Or sometimes they'll click their beak. But my grandmother was getting mad, and she said, oh, one of our fishermen are gonna die. So she went home and she started baking pies and everything. And within 3 days, we heard that one of the fishermen died in the river. And so she went and brought all the pies to that home. And another time I saw a little bird flying down on her, and it was saying something that she didn't like, and it would keep teasing her, and she would get mad. And she's saying, oh, he's calling me Shorty, just because he was way up here and he's calling her Shorty. So she, she'd fight with get mad at the birds, and she'd get mad at the bears, and I so scared because one time I saw her and she was outside, and she came back inside, got 2 pots, and she's banging them together. And I looked out the window and I saw a bear sitting in her apple tree. And I looked again and I saw another bear, and they're all huge. And there was 2 in one tree, and there's 2 in another, and there's 1 in another one. And they would not, I was so scared they're gonna jump down and eat my grandmother. She was up there banging or out there banging, yelling at them and help mail them. And they'd just be reaching for the fruit and eating it. And I thought, oh my gosh. You know, I thought they would jump down and gobble her up, but they just ate her fruit. And she kept saying, that's not yours. And she kept calling them bad. But they just stayed where they were. I'd like to see Chief and Council fighting for us more, fighting for our, to have decent housing. Like, it's, you know, my mother lives in a home. She's retired, well, semi-retired, but she works from home. She should have a nice home. You know, I deserve a nice home. I have 4 letters saying that my carpets need to come out. And they keep saying there's no money, there's no money. There has to be money somewhere. And they just got how many millions from Kinder Morgan, and they said, oh, they froze it for 25 years. And, you know, look at your people, look at your homes. I invited the Chief and Council to come look at my carpets. That when I moved in that home, that 20 years ago, the carpets were there. 20 years ago, I was promised new carpets or new flooring. 20 years ago, they promised me 20 years, and I still have the same horrible carpets that I shouldn't have moved in the first place, but they promised me next month we'll do your floors.
Hey, good morning. My name is Stephen Williams. My traditional name is Malathiatul. Where we're standing, you know, right here, you know, this is where I grew up. This is where I grew up. See, this Skwah territory, Skwah here. But this here, to the left here, all this, it's an island. It's Skwah. Skwah. On the right side of the bridge, Skwah. Over here, Skwah. So this is where I grew up when I was younger. We moved out of here in 1960 into the main village. But no, just thinking back, when I was younger, this was our playground. This was our playground right down here. We had canoes down here. We had big logs we used to play with inside the water here, but long time ago, this water was clean. This water was clean. You can see the gravel in the bottom. That's why we say that was our playground right down here. And we have a long history of canoeing. See, even right down over here. I'm just remembering back when I was 5 years old. I was 5 years old. My brother was 6. And my mother gave us 2 buckets, told us to go pick some fruit. We didn't think, didn't even think twice. We just went down in the canoe, and we paddled down about a kilometer and a half. Picked those plums, and then we came back and gave it to our mother. And I was talking to some of the parents. Can you imagine yourself sending a 5 and a 6-year-old down the water to paddle, to pick fruit? In our days, that was the norm. It was normal for us to be in the water all the time, because we lived in the water. My dad and my brothers, they paddled across the river to cut cottonwood, cut firewood. Then they'd bring it home, go fishing out the river. So that's the way we got around. Okay, just the way we grew up. I guess we have a lot of children, but then we grew up in there. We grew up in there. This house here. When I was growing up, there used to be 5 or 6 of us in one room. Then we had it upstairs, and my brothers stayed up there. I think there were 3 of them stayed there. Then there's another part of the house, the other brother stayed in there. So we've always, had a lot of people in our house. I'm the 7th son. There's 9 brothers and 6 sisters in my family, my siblings. So right now there's only 3 of us left, 3 brothers and 3 sisters left out of that 9 brothers and 6 sisters. We're not part of that Stalo territory. Us right here, where we're standing, we're the Palau territory. It's 4 different reserves. There's us, there's Skwah, and there's Chiam up in Rosedale. It goes up that way, and down to Skwah. Then you go down to Ashwell Road, Coquaplet. Then there's Popcom. See, when you talk about Palau territory, what my dad was saying. He say you go to Rosedale, and Rosedale was a central area where everybody gathered. Then what he said about the Palau territory, you stand in Rosedale and you look far as your eye can see. That's Palau territory. Because part of it goes across the river to the Harrison side, and down along the mountain, just before you get to the state side. That's all Palau territory. Comes this way here. Okay, the canoes we're looking at right now, this is the newest one. We just got this year. It's the first year it was in the races. And we're talking about our races. We've been canoeing. A lot of our little ones, they start when they're 4 and 5 years old. What I was mentioning earlier. It just seemed to be a norm for us to be canoeing in the water all the time. For me, I started when I was 12. My uncles and my cousins, they trained just about a half a kilometer up the road here, and I used to watch them. They used to go, they'd be gone for about 20 minutes, and then they'd come back again.